good paper in a city, to some extent, tends to be the soul of the city.
The thing about newspapers is that they've been called many times over, history's rough first draft.
It's the big paper as far as print journalism in British Columbia, really in Western Canada. Well, we're in our 100th year now, of course, and it's allowed us to look back and look at the influence of the paper all the way through successive world wars.
Well, this is my 37th year at the Vancouver Sun. It's always been a paper that can challenge one professionally. I think it's a paper that one can respect.
And so the story of the Vancouver Sun is not just a story of journalism, which has changed dramatically in 100 years, from pen and paper to iPad and through all the printing technology. It's the story of the city.
You see the power of the writing and the power of the writers and the certain characters that emerged with every generation. So it seems that every generation had their columnists who were the voice of the city.
It was a scrappy little port town, like a real outpost, like little shanties built all along the waterfront, a lot of crime. And then kind of in the late 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, it started developing into a place where people came and there was a lot of work.
I was in my late 20s, I guess, when I did come out here. I was working in London, in Fleet Street, for a paper that I'd always wanted to work for, the London Evening Standard. And all this was fine until I met this Canadian who happened to come from Vancouver.
It didn't really take much to lure him to Vancouver.
So late 20s, thinking about what may or may not happen in the next 40 years is something that you really don't spend too much time on. There were things once upon a time called typewriters, and they were amazing. You hit the key and a little hammer came out and whacked the paper through an ink ribbon, and typewriters. Typewriters, when you get 120, 130 people using them simultaneously, make a hell of a lot of noise. Newsrooms in those days were earthy places, apart from a certain predilection for liquid sustenance. I think journalists and editors tend to be a bunch who smoke pretty heavily.
The paper in the early days was a very sexist place, just the way it was. Women were sort of relegated to what, the potted plant section, fashion, style, what was sometimes called the ovary tower.
But then, there's always been, in my experience, a smattering of female reporters or writers, things like fashion, of course, and the social pages. But in the last 10 years, definitely, this has been significantly redressed.
By the time I came on, we had Patricia Graham and Val Castleton and Adrienne Tanner. All of my editors were female. I mean, that just seemed to be the norm to me here.
In the early days, a lot of the sales were on the streets. Newsboys hawked them, and so you had to have those big headlines because you're competing with the Province and the News Herald or whatever else was on the newsstands. News is news. I mean, world news is about is about the way people live. It's about crime. It's about politics. It's about all those things. We've never stopped covering the same things in 100 years. Just do it a lot differently. It's a direct reflection on the culture of the day. Our headlines talked about Japs. We referred all during the war. No question it was derogatory. When the Komagata Maru was stranded here, the coverage was extremely interesting because the Sun was sort of semi-sympathetic, but there were some stories in the Sun that were, shocking, like Hindus bring disease to Vancouver. And then you'd have another story sort of refuting that. And you can't rewrite history, but it is definitely a reflection of the racism of the day and people's just pure ignorance.
The Clifford Olson case, which really was a major story, one of the major stories in my experience at the Sun, to start with the pattern of vanishing young people, girls and boys. It was something of the end of the age of innocence for Vancouver. Here on their own doorstep was something going on that previously just belonged in the headlines of stories coming out of the States. Here it was right in your own backyard.
From 1912 to 2012, housing. You know, that has never fallen from the headlines, ever. The price of housing, urban sprawl, the kind of housing, it has never ever fallen off the radar, which I think is very interesting, and I'm not sure that's any different in any other city. But for Vancouver, always been a big story for 100 years. Just sort of like the price of houses, over 100 years, one of the biggest issues has been transportation. How do you get where you go, and where do you build a bridge, and why do you build a bridge?
Expo 86 was a great story.
It was sort of one of those times when the city was really coming into its own.
Finally, a success story after some nail-biting times leading up to the fair.
I think that for us, it trained the world's eyes on us. I think that we comported ourselves very well. I think you know, a lot of famous people came and entertained, and you know, came to open it, and you know, I think that I think it really put us on the map.
And that, of course, much more recently, was followed up in a similar vein with the Winter Olympics, which were, again, an extremely exciting and positive event to be involved in. Newsrooms now are, I'll say, distressingly silent. Slowly, decade by decade, as computers have taken over in communication, as well as, you know, replacing shouting across the room, it's an amazing transformation.
It's a streamlining process. We've moved a lot to the iPad, to the iPhone, just to multimedia applications. But to get the news from print to digital, it's a natural progression, but it isn't one without its bumps and bruises, I think.
When it comes to, you know, the changing technology of the paper, you really have to go with it. I wish that my ability to keep up with it was quite as effective as my enthusiasm.
There's definitely more to do now, but I think a lot of people, especially who grew up with the internet, who spent a lot of time on the internet as a kid, I don't think it's necessarily that difficult.
How long more shall I give this this great game?
I can't say what it's going to be like in 5 years here. I can't see myself doing anything other than journalism.
I hope there will be a paper in 25 years. I don't see it going away. As I say, it may look different. It may look a little more magazine-y, because again, breaking news is something people want now, not tomorrow morning.
I'd like to think 3 or 4 years, maybe 5. Take me up to 50 years in the game.